Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm glad to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll discuss what's happened in Boulder, Colorado, and its implications for Canada as the McCartney government navigates the challenges between domestic politics and geopolitics. And if time permits, we'll also cover what the Trump administration is characterizing as so-called one big beautiful bill, what it means for American fiscal policy and the Republican Party's coalition. David, thanks as always for joining me.
Thank you.
David, it's regrettable that we're speaking again in the immediate aftermath of another horrific attack rooted in anti-Semitism, but alas that we are. Why don't we just open by you reflecting on this attack in Boulder, Colorado, and what it tells us about the state of anti-Semitism within our societies?
Well, a way to think about this is to compare what's happening in North America now with what happened in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War gave rise to large movements of protest, much of it peaceful, but much of it sort of unconventional, like not tidy marches and lines, not picketing, but really kind of emotional, theatrical, performative, with a lot of symbolic violence. The anti-Vietnam War movement begins to do a lot, pouring blood over people, that kind of thing. Symbolic violence that really gets moving after about 1969. The American presence in Vietnam winds down in 1971, but the Vietnam War movement doesn't really feel that it's won because, after all, President Nixon is reelected in 1972. And so what happens is most of the movement demobilizes, goes home,
Yes.
and turns to other things. But a hardcore within the movement are dissatisfied with the outcome, and they turn to ever-increasing violence. And so in 1971, 72, even into 73, you have bombs going off. People on the fringe of the anti-war movement are sending bombs to post offices. A bomb is sent to the Pentagon. Dozens and dozens of bombs go off. The lethality of the bombs is not that terrible, fortunately, but again, this is stepping over the line from symbolic into real violence. I think as the war in Gaza winds down, we're seeing something similar happening. There is a big mobilization of sentiment in North America against Israel. Most of it peaceful, but a lot of it symbolically violent. It wasn't, again, not people standing in lines and marching with placards, but standing outside Jewish nursing homes, standing outside Jewish schools, and then a minority of the minority begin to push their symbolic violence even farther. They fire shots at schools. Now they fire them at 5 a.m. when it's a good guess that there won't be anybody there. It's intended as a threat, not actually to hurt anybody. But the habit of violence is cumulative, and the alienated minority looks around for permission from its partners and colleagues and comrades, and finding no objection, a number of the people will get worse and worse. And what has happened in the United States, attacks in Boulder, murder of people coming out of a Jewish event in Washington, D.C., the torching of the house of Pennsylvania's governor, who is Jewish, Josh Shapiro. You see that as most of the activity subsides, a violent core continue to act in ever more dangerous ways. And Canada is not immune to this. Canadian governments give a lot of permission to symbolic violence edging over into actual violence. Prime Minister Stephen Harper gave a warning just this past week about the Canadian tolerance for some of the fringe activity in the Sikh movement. Canada needs to get serious about domestic security before there is bloodshed on Canadian streets. The symbolic violence has already arrived. The actual violence is lagging, probably not far behind.
We'll come to Canada in a minute, but I want to put to you, David, a question about how we should think about the causes and sources of this symbolic turned actual violence. We've had a lot of different guests on our podcast over the past several months, talking about the rise of what sometimes characterizes the new anti-Semitism, a grafting of contemporary progressive ideas about colonialism and a victim and oppressor and all the rest, grafted onto old school and anti-Semitism. There's also been an effort, I think, to try to understand the extent to which the sources are new immigrants or people who've come to Canada and the United States, sometimes bringing with them historic prejudices and other sources of racism or anti-Semitism, as I say, or whether it is younger people here within our own societies who have been influenced and shaped by these sets of ideologies. Why don't you just reflect a bit on how you've come to understand the causes and sources of what we're seeing play out in places like Boulder, Washington, Toronto, Montreal, and elsewhere in North America?
Yeah. Well, three different. So in Boulder, the culprit, or the apparent culprit, was a recent immigrant from the Middle East, animated pretty obviously by Islamic extremist ideology. Um, and so that's a classic case of the hatred was imported from abroad. It was a foreign quarrel coming to the United States and expressing itself with violence. The good news is, because he was a foreigner, he wasn't able to get weapons. He tried for a
Yes.
gun permit, and I didn't know that there was anybody in the United States who couldn't get a gun, but it turns out there are some people who can't, and so he wasn't able to get a gun, amazingly, mercifully. So he had to rely instead on these improvised incendiary devices, which were terrible enough, but didn't result in the dozens of dead that could have followed had he been able to get his hands on a firearm. Um, the case in Washington involves someone who is not from the Middle East, who seemed to have who had a completely different background, and who had internalized this as a way of expressing his rage, his hatred, his alienation from the society, go attack Jewish people or people he thought were Jewish, as a way to sort of sign up for what has become a kind of universal radical cause, not specific to the Middle East. So that's branch one, the imported hatred. Branch two is people sort of absorbing this as their way of expressing their alienation from the society. The person who torched Governor Shapiro's house seems to have been just a more general kind of malcontent, but this again was available to him. I mean, grievances are often available.
Yes.
Uh, why do people start slapping paint on old masters in order to protest climate change? Well, their friends are doing it. It becomes something. It's not nice. Most of the people who do that didn't invent that idea for themselves. Somebody had the idea and they copycat it. From a point of view of the actions of the government, um, uh, governments, of course, have to uphold and protect the right of peaceful protest. Canadian governments are very hypocritical about how they do that. There are some forms of peaceful protest. You want to rally 40 skinheads to go protest a pride march. You'll find that your right of peaceful protest is quite narrow. You
Yes.
want to mobilize 40 people to go protest in front of a Jewish old age home. Your right of peaceful protest is quite big. So Canadian governments, it's very obvious that some forms of protest get more leeway than others according to the government's calculation of the votes that are at stake. And the question of how peaceful your protest has to be deemed peaceful. Again, there are certain protests that are allowed much more symbolic violence than other groups are allowed. Um,
Yes.
uh, but inside the groups that are doing symbolic violence are you will find people who know about the acts of real violence that are being planned, and governments or that are waiting temptation or trigger. And governments have to be much more vigorous about this. And they need to understand that while most of the people who chant Free Palestine will never hurt anybody, the people who hurt somebody have all been at marches chanting Free Palestine. So you need to know what's going on inside. You need better information. You need penetration. And just as a matter of decency, you need to have clearer standards that the rules for saying God hates fags need to be the rule for the same rules for saying Free Palestine. And where if you say, look, one, they're both free speech, they both are a threat, they're both connected to violence. Somebody will do violence. Both you have a right to say both, um, but the government needs to keep an eye on the people who are saying both because one of those people may turn violent.
Well, and that's a good segue into your earlier observations about what this means for Canada. Not only has the country been marked by a laxness when it comes to internal security, there's also politics overlaid on these questions. Why don't you talk a bit about
Yeah.
why you worry Canada may be susceptible because of those two dynamics, security and politics, for these types of performative forms of violence to turn into actual violence?
Well, we have to be very worried look, we've had a killing on Canadian soil caused apparently by the Indian state to target someone who was accused of violence on behalf of an independent Sikh homeland. And the Canadian government has gotten itself into kind of an imbroglio here that there's not a good way out of. And Prime Minister Stephen Harper has been looking for a way out. But the backdrop to all of this is the Indian government is becoming more militaristic in its response to diaspora violence, in part because governments, and especially Canada's, have been lax on diaspora violence. And it may be legal to fundraise in Canada, but Canadian that fundraising has been going to causes that are not legal. And Canadian governments just need to be more responsible about saying, you know what, that Canada has to have a real security policy, not just a policy for gaining ethnic votes in crucial ridings.
Yeah, well, let's stay on that point, David, because the Israel-Gaza question is one that shot right through the Liberal Party caucus in the
Yeah.
last parliament. The party's traditional support for Israel was diminished, in part because of the inclusion of new and different voices, both within the parliamentary caucus itself, and then I think the party more broadly. Part of that reflects, I think, the changing nature of the Liberal Party to a more ideological party, but part of that, of course, is a function of the changing demographics of Canada itself. To talk a bit about how the new prime minister, new party leader, Mark Carney, navigates those types of issues.
Well, the Liberal Party of Canada has a tried and tested tradition of veering to the left on international issues every time it needs to veer to the right on domestic issues. And the classic example of this is the Pierre Trudeau government in the second half of the 70s. So Pierre Trudeau comes to power in 1968. He runs a very free spending government from 68 to 72. The inflation problem gets worse. He then leads a minority government from 72 to 74, more free
Yes.
spending. The inflation problem continues to get worse. He wins a majority in 74, goes to Germany for a summit and gets scolded by Helmut Schmidt that Canada's finances are in disarray. And he comes home and he gets religion and says, okay, we're going to try to tighten up the finances. And although he's not successful because for a variety of reasons, program spending does begin to get contracted in the late 1970s. And that's when Trudeau starts doing things like going to visit Fidel Castro all the time because he's trying to reassure the people who are unhappy about what he's doing at home that my heart remains with you on anti-Americanism, on support for third world revolutionary movements. And I wonder if something like that is not going to repeat with Mark Carney, that Canada needs a fiscal tightening. We'll talk about that in the next segment of the program. I think Carney knows that better than almost anybody. I think he's more determined to deliver that fiscal tightening than most. Um, and he's got a caucus that will not like it. So what can he give them to make up for the fiscal tightening that he probably feels he needs to do, and that he probably will try to do?
Yeah. Well, yeah, let's take the opportunity to shift to what is being called one big beautiful bill
Yeah,
before the U.S. Congress. It's an omnibus piece of legislation that, as I understand it, David, involves reauthorizing most of the 2016 tax cuts, including some new provisions that we can talk about.
yeah.
It has a mix of spending reductions that were identified through the so-called Doge process, as well as authorities for a bunch of new spending. And then finally, it has a set of provisions around the Trump administration's ongoing efforts to deport illegal migrants.
Yeah.
Uh, Maybe before we get into to some of the details and how it's playing out, why don't you just reflect on the legislation and how our listeners and viewers ought to think about it?
Well, there's so much to say, but let me just start with a kind of a joke or a funny story. So my late father was a successful real estate developer. He retired from most of his operating businesses in 2007, and spent the next 6 years of his life primarily serving on boards of various kinds of other companies. And I asked him once how he liked his service, and he said, "Well, it was a little frustrating because he realized after a while that he had only one job on each of these boards, which was to say, this project that you're proposing, it looks good. What happens if interest rates go up 2 points?" And all the people on the board who are 30 and 40 years younger than him would give him a pitying look, he said, and say, "Interest rates don't go up, old man. Interest rates go down." Because if you've been active in business from the 9/11 attacks to post-COVID, your experience has been of interest rates falling from not very much to almost nothing to a point where sometimes they actually would pay you to borrow the money.
Yes.
Um, okay, well, one of the changes in the post-COVID world is that money is no longer free. Interest rates are now meaningful again, and on the rise, and probably, and if given the other policies of the Trump administration, probably likely to continue to rise. There were the Federal Reserve, had Biden been reelected, there would have likely been Federal Reserve cuts in short-term interest rates in 2025. But the combination of the supply shocks of the immigration crackdown and the tariffs, plus Trump's complete indifference to the deficit, means that we're probably going to have the interest rates will stay at least where they are and maybe even rise. And if that happens, almost all of the Trump projections are all based on the assumption of interest rates in the threes, or federal
Yes.
interest rates in the threes. If the federal interest rates go and stay in the fours or worse, then all of his plans become nonsense. And Canada is facing this too. Huge Canada is facing a big rise in debt service costs. Canada, which had been
Yes.
like the model student in fiscal management through the 1990s, through the 2000s, Canada just left after 2015. Something happened that year, and all discipline went out the window. And Canada now has a big debt, and the money was free for a while, but it's not free anymore. So fiscal tightening is going to come, and it's not going to be agreeable to anybody. And the reason Trump is making a big, beautiful bill is because he's cramming into it other things that are going to make the problem worse. I mean, to say we're gonna have tariffs and an immigration crackdown at the same time as interest rates are generally rising. This is a formula for a lot of shocks.
Yeah. I want to stay on this point, David, because it's confounded a lot of economic and fiscal policy observers that the U.S. government's extraordinary accumulation of debt over the past 2 decades or so has not had much of an effect on bond rates, its borrowing
Yeah,
costs. It's almost as if markets have not known how to handle
yeah.
such a rise in debt for the world's reserve currency. We are now starting to see markets ask tougher questions.
Yeah.
Why don't you just talk about that?
Well, let me. I mean, this is not an idea original to me, but I've been very influenced by it. Um, what most of us see, the easy way of looking at the problem of the United States government having a lot of debt is, my gosh, they spent more than they collected. That created a shortfall. That's the deficit annually, and the debt compounded, and this is going to be a problem. But turn it around. There's another way to look at it, which is the bigger the American debt, the more U.S. bonds there are. U.S. bonds were the safest asset on the planet, um, and safer than gold. Gold can melt in a fire. Gold can be stolen. Gold you have to pay to store. But the U.S. bond, not only was it safe, but it paid you. And so through the 2000s, the early 2000s, one way to think about what happened was there was a global shortage of safe assets, and especially of the safest assets. And however many dollar bonds the United States created, there was a market for them because India and China and many other places were hungry, hungry, hungry for places to put wealth where it could be relied on to be there when you needed it. The but the United States, the American end of that bargain was to keep the assets safe. And in the past 6 months, the American assets have suddenly looked a lot less safe.
Hmm.
One of the things that is little noticed, the most intelligent member of the Trump economic team, Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent, when he is asked, what are these tariffs for? What are you trying to do? He will say, well, what we're trying to do is put pressure on our creditors to agree to rewrite our bonds on better terms. Instead of a 30-year due date, there'll be a 100-year due date. They'll lower the coupon. Well, if a borrower imposes on a creditor worse terms than the creditor signed up for at the beginning, that's a default. It's not a total default. It's not a unilateral default. It's a negotiated and managed default, but it's a
Yes.
default.
Yes.
And if you're defaulting, you are not a safe asset, even if you're defaulting just a little bit by making it 100 years instead of 30, or asking for a point off or half a point off, what was negotiated at the time the bond was sold. So in a world in which if the United States is changing its policy on its debt to make sure that that is no longer such a safe asset, then the infinite appetite that was there may no longer be there. And
Yeah.
if at the same time you get greater unity in Europe, where where euro-denominated bonds begin to look like almost as safe an asset as the dollar. I mean, they don't have the hundreds of years of history. The euro's a relative newcomer. Um, but you may find that the people who need to store wealth safely look for other ways to do it, um, and that is a formula again for trouble. I think this Trump economic policy, while each individual piece of it is bad, you add it together and it's much worse than the pieces on their own.
David, we're speaking on the 4th of June. In recent days, Elon Musk has left the administration. His exercise of so-called Doge, an effort to identify and eliminate inefficiencies and wasteful spending in government, I think it's fair to characterize as mostly a failure. Talk a bit about why, in your mind, Doge failed and
Yeah.
what it tells us about our ability or inability to bring U.S. federal spending under control.
Well, Elon Musk is obviously a brilliant and capable person who often says foolish, stupid, uninformed, and crazy things. And so the question about Doge is which part of his brain did Doge come from? The brilliant and capable part or the foolish and gullible part? Because if the brilliant and capable part, you think, Doge it's not only a failure, it was so obviously going to be a failure. It was, it was so obviously, the United States spends almost all of its spending on healthcare for old people, rural people, veterans, military spending, um, old age pensions, debt service. That's where I'm not going to forget I'm going to forget the exact percentage, but the overwhelming, I mean, not
Yes,
70%, the overwhelming majority is healthcare for favored groups, um, defense, service on the debt. That's where the money goes. Um, so the idea that you're going to do anything by stopping PEPFAR in Africa, that you're going to, yes, I mean, PEPFAR, I think, costs $7 billion a year, which is a lot of money, but not compared to the budget of the United States.
yes,
And it's just gratuitous harm. And the functional part of Elon Musk's brain had to know that. He's got to be, he's a numbers guy. He's got to know that. Now, one of the things Doge did was it shut down the parts of the government that were giving a lot of trouble to Elon Musk personally. The IRS is broken, the Securities and Exchange Commission is broken, and he had problems with both of those government agencies. So if we credit Doge to the functional Musk, then you think the real operating part of Doge was the part that was shutting down government agencies that were causing him trouble and collect and maybe collecting some data that could be useful to him for business enterprises and as tools against his competitors. If you think it's the non-functional part of his brain that produced Doge, then you realize, oh, he's just like another loudmouth who thinks that the government is spending all of its money on foreign aid and is just refusing to look at the books that show where the money actually goes.
yeah. David, a through line for a lot of our conversations over the past few years has been the evolution of the Republican Party's voter coalition,
Yeah.
the extent to which the party is increasingly representative of a more downscale working class median voter, and yet a lot of the tax measures included in the reauthorization of the tax package obviously push higher up the income distribution. There have been some, like for better or for worse, to his credit, Steve Bannon, who've pointed out this inherent tension. Why don't you talk a bit about it and what it says about the limitations of the Republican Party genuinely becoming a multiracial working class coalition?
Well, just to drive home this contrast, last night, on the night before you and I record, there's a big gala event in Washington, in the National Building Museum, black tie, in which Vice President Vance, in black tie, on the stage of the National Building Museum, talked about the need to reinvent the Republican Party as a working class party that has high tariffs because that's supposedly good for the working class. And I don't know what it costs to rent the National Building Museum, but it's one of the premier venues in Washington, D.C. It's this huge hall with massive columns. It used to be the office where they process the pensions for Union war veterans, and now it's turned into this basically an event space. And while and black tie doesn't come cheap, And the food and dinner and the wine and the flowers, that's not free either. And
Yes.
so this big event, all in the name of working class solidarity, it's gotta you gotta smell a rat coming from it. But the people involved think that they're doing something real. Um, but it is true that we are seeing a shift, and there's now new data from the 2024 election about um, how what the way to think about this is not just that the Republican Party is becoming more multiracial, but it's becoming less, can I say bisexual? That is that what we're basically seeing is um, white women and especially educated white women moving out of the Republican coalition, their historic home, decisively toward the Democrats, and men
Yes.
of all races and ethnicities and all classes moving out of the Democratic coalition and into the Republican coalition. So the Republicans are becoming less white and more male, and the Democrats are becoming um, uh, less of two genders and more white. Um,
Um, Go ahead. Pardon
And
me.
so the point is that we're paying for the decrease in racial and ethnic polarization with an increase in sexual polarization.
Yes. And as that evolution's happening, one gets the sense that Republican lawmakers are struggling to catch up with their policy priorities.
Right.
So we have tax cut provisions that involve significant reductions for corporations and those who earn high incomes, a how would I put it? Narrowing of the state and local tax deduction provisions that were part of the 2016 tax package, which would disproportionately benefit high earners, including in New York
Well,
City. Thank you.
I'm
Thank you
going to
very
correct
much.
you. You keep saying 2016, you mean 2017. It's the first year of the Trump administration, not the last year of the Obama administration.
Pardon me, 2017. Um, and yet there's not a lot there, David, for those voters that ostensibly Vance and others at the event last night are aiming to appeal to. How do you explain that disconnect?
Well, I would say that Vance is aiming to appeal to those voters, but he's not ever planning actually to deliver for them. That he's trying to hornswoggle them. So the Republicans do well with the voters who pay the least attention to politics. So that has an advantage for the Republicans and a disadvantage. It means that in the planning part of the bill, you can say this is a working class bill. Well, actually, delivering nothing and doing a lot of harm to those people. And so long as it is being discussed in Washington, the new Republican voters don't know very much about it because they're not paying a lot of attention. They're detached
Mm,
from the political
mm,
system. The penalty is if and when you actually do these things, they're going to come as a tremendous shock to a lot of people who trusted Trump. If people are cast off Medicaid, if they discover that imported goods suddenly cost a lot more, if they discover you can't get various kinds of products, including cars and trucks, because of Trump's tariffs, um, there's been lots of warning, but the people whom the Trump coalition depends on don't pay follow, and so they don't know about those warnings. It's going to all come as a tremendous surprise to them, and so they're the hornswoggling. You get away with it when your voters are not attentive voters, but sooner or later they feel the reality, and the reality is going to hurt, and they may be mad.
Final question. We are seeing some Republican lawmakers mad about what the bill represents in terms of ongoing deficits and rising debt. Senator Rand Paul has spoken out against it. I mentioned Musk himself in recent days has called out the bill's profligacy. Um, is this a stand on the part of those Republicans who purport to be committed to balanced budgets and limited government? Are we seeing, in a way, David, a tension between what is sometimes characterized as the freedom cons versus the nat cons? And if so, what's the significance?
I wouldn't count on it actually. I wouldn't count on it. I think where this bill is probably going to go is it's passed the House, of course, already. There'll be a version in the Senate where they do more fake bookkeeping to make the deficit and the debt look smaller. And that will include some assumptions about the future direction of interest. A game I was told by that budget practitioners play is if you've got an estimate of something that's going to cost 3.24444, like that the budget gets rounded at a certain number of digits. And depending on where you make your estimate, you can create an estimate that's only like $10,000 apart, but that rounds down to 3.2 and rather than rounding up to 3.3. And in the context of a federal budget, if you can produce a number that rounds down to 3.2, that has huge effects as compared to a number that rounds up to 3.3. So you just take $10,000 off the bill at the far end of the stream of post decimal point digits, and you can do some things. So I think there's going to be a lot of gaming like that. Um, but ultimately, they're going to make a big bet. They're going to persuade their fellow Republicans to make a big bet that interest rates are not going to rise at all in the second half of 2025 and may, in fact, resume the downward trend that they had under Biden. And therefore, the situation is not as scary and bad. But it's going to be fiscal engineering. It's not going to be real fiscal change. And then I think the United States, I think they're going to pass it. They'll pass something. And I think the United States is heading for really severe fiscal trouble in the second half of the 2020s at a time when the US Treasury bond is no longer the safe asset that it was. So Trump is going to leave behind not only damage to American security arrangements, but to America's financial architecture in a way that's much bigger than the kind of shallow discussion of the so-called big beautiful bill allows.
It sounds like they'll regret not having your father around the table, David, to remind them of interest rate risk. I want to thank you for joining me as always, for sharing your insights on a bunch of the big questions facing Canadian policy and politics. And I look forward to catching up in a couple of weeks.
Bye bye.